ground for our thinking about man and the experience of freedom, I want to read two I want to read two paragraphs from The Inward Journey. It is a strange freedom to be adrift in the world of men without a sense of anchor anywhere. Always there is the need of mooring, the need for the firm grip on something that is rooted and will not give, the urge to be accountable to someone, to know that beyond the individual himself there is an answer that must be given, cannot be denied. The very spirit of a man tends to panic from the desolation of going nameless up and down the streets of other minds where no salutation greets and no friendly recognition makes secure. It is a strange freedom to be adrift in the world of men. Always a way must be found for bringing into one solitary place the settled look from another's face, for getting the quiet sanction of another's grace to undergird the meaning of the self. To be ignored, to be passed over as of no account and of no meaning, is to be made into a faceless thing, not a man. It is better to be the complete victim of an anger unrestrained and a wrath which knows no bounds, to be torn asunder without mercy or battered to a pulp by angry violence, than to be passed over as if one were not. Here at least one is dealt with, encountered, vanquished, or overwhelmed, but not ignored. It is a strange freedom to go nameless up and down the streets of other minds where no salutation greets and no sign is given to mark the place one calls one's own. The name marks the claim a man stakes against the world. It is the private banner under which he moves, which is his right, whatever else betides. The name is a man's watermark above which the tides can never rise. It is the thing he holds that keeps him in the way when every light has failed and every marker has been destroyed. To be made anonymous and to give to it the acquiescence of the heart is to live without life. And for such a one, even death is no dying. It is a strange freedom to be adrift in the world of men, to act with no accounting, to go nameless up and down the streets of other minds where no salutation greets and no sign is given to mark the place one calls one's own. Man and the experience of freedom as a phrase under the banner of which I want to do our thinking about this subject is this. Give me the strength to be free and to endure the burden of freedom and the loneliness of those without chains. This is the subject. Give me the strength to be free and to endure the burden of freedom and the loneliness of those without chains. In my thought, there is a fundamental difference between liberty and freedom. Liberty, in my thought, has to do with those prerogatives, privileges, grants that a particular social arrangement, social contract makes possible for the individuals who live within the context of that contract. Its locus is outside of the individual, and it can be given or withheld in accordance to the judgment and the will or the behavior of those external to oneself who grant it. Liberty, in one important sense, is external. It is located in the arrangement, in the external arrangement, in the social climate in which one lives and functions and behaves. Whereas it would seem to me that freedom is a quality of being. It is a quality of spirit. It is what the individual is aware of, if I may put it that way, when he is searching out, trying to discover what it is at last that ultimately he amounts to in his own sight. Therefore, it is never completely contingent upon the external context, even though its meaning may be defined somewhat by the external context. When a man is asking himself, what is it really, stripped to whatever there is in me that is literal and irreducible, what is it that ultimately I amount to within the tight circle of my own self-awareness? It is in that area of the mind and the spirit that I think the issue of freedom rests. So, I would like to begin then by providing my first little working definition, working formula in the light of this background. Freedom, in the first instance, is the will and the ability so to act at any moment in time as to influence, determine, the future. So to act at any moment in time so as to determine and or influence the future. It is in this sense that freedom establishes for the individual its own grounds of integrity. It is true, you see, that at any given moment in time, I am a victim of my own story as my story fulfills itself from the beginning to the present. The meaning of this I shall get to before I finish, but I had to say it at that moment so as to remind myself that later on I must say it. Freedom does not have to do with a man's fate in the light of this first working definition. Bear in mind what the working definition is, you see, that a man can act in the present so as to influence the future. The time and the place of a man's life is the time and place of his body. But the meaning and the significance of his life is as creative, as vast, as meaningful as the powers of his mind and spirit and his commitment can make it. So that a man at any given moment then is the victim in a sense of his fate, which is the logic of his story. But he can act in that moment of time in a manner that can be fundamentally decisive. And this is the area in which it seems to me the margin and the reality and the integrity of the experience of freedom first registers itself. So that the function then of the first working definition is merely to establish what seems to me to be the grounds of the fundamental autonomy of the human spirit in the midst of the social and physical and natural forces by which that human spirit is surrounded. And I move then to the second working definition, which is the one with which my mind wants to wrestle or play, depending upon the point of view. Freedom is the sense of the feel for, the awareness of alternatives. It is the sense of option. At any given moment, with reference to any set of circumstances by which the life at that given moment may be surrounded, held, enclosed, bound, whatever word you want to use to describe the condition. And mark you, I do not say that freedom is the opting of the option. It is the sense of option. the sense of option. It is entirely possible that at any given moment, the individual may be surrounded by forces over which he is unable to exercise any control whatsoever. There is a radical sense in which every man's life is victimized by impersonal forces, be they social with the human content, or be they natural forces on which his mind cannot make an impact. They don't know he's there. I remember when I was a student in upstate New York many years ago, I got off the interurban at the wrong spot in a blizzard, and when I stepped off, I was in snow up to my waist, and there wasn't anybody in sight. and I knew that this interurban must stop at a cross street, so I went about 5 or 10 feet and then decided I would turn left rather than right and wandered down this country road. I could hardly see my hand in front of my face, even though it was a moonlight night, because the snow was so thick. And after going indefinitely, I don't want to tell all the story, but after going what seemed to be 1,000 years, quietly I discovered that I had been panicking for some time, but I didn't know it. and I said, I'm too young to freeze to death. that my life is just beginning, and I have all these dreams. It's my first year in graduate theological school, and everything is before me. And I began addressing the blizzard. But the blizzard did not even know I was there. I just kept on blizzarding. Now this is what I mean, that our lives are surrounded by these forces in which it seems at any given moment that at that moment all options are frozen. So that freedom is not contingent upon the opting of the option. Freedom is contingent upon keeping alive in the individual the sense of option. The sense of option. When I was a boy living in my hometown in Florida, a traveling evangelist came through our community, and he had a wonderful service one night, and my mother permitted me to go with her, and I remember something he said. I must have been 9 years old, something like that. He was given a personally conducted tour through hell. This was, and he described how it went. And he came to first place to which this guide took him was a huge auditorium in which there were card tables and 4 people, 2 couples at every table, millions of people. And they were playing cards, which at that time, the card game that kept you out of heaven was 5 Up. That was the name of the game. So think of it. Millions and millions of couples sitting at card tables playing 5 Up forever and ever and ever. And the thing that made it hell was not fire and brimstone. No. No options. No options. No options. Now, this is what I'm getting at. Now, to be sure that you understand, because it's critical to my thought, let me illustrate it in one other very simple way. I had two sisters as I grew up, and one was older and one was younger. My older sister made it very difficult for my life because she wanted me to stay her little brother. And I was determined that was running out. and so we were going huckleberry picking one afternoon, and as we walked along going out to the woods where the huckleberries were to be found, I noticed a tiny baby snake, about a little longer than a healthy kitchen match. And I knew that she was afraid of any kind of crawling anything. So I called her attention to this little baby snake, and she reacted according to definition. And then I said, oh, no, there's nothing to be afraid of. I'm making the case for my recognition. There's nothing to be afraid of. See, I'm not afraid. I'll just stand on him. So I put one of my bare feet on this little creature, and the weight of my body completely immobilized him physically, so he couldn't do this. But there came up my leg faint, rhythmic shudders. He couldn't move, but he could do this. Now that is what I mean. Keeping alive a sense of option and making it hold day in and day out, month after weary month, against that time when the option can begin to move. And when a man lets that die, I don't care what he has, he's a slave. Now, this carries with it certain interesting dimensions. Of course, I don't think that there can be this sense of option where the sense of self has disintegrated. Well, well, I guess that's the best way to say that. For where there is no sense of self, there can be no sense of option. And one of the tragedies of any society, one of the tragedies in the life of any individual, if in his in the living of the life, the private life or the collective life, the individual becomes anonymous. Anonymous. So that he has no private inner sense of authenticity. He is in his own inner field a nobody. So that there can be no sense of self in that kind of vacuum. So that perhaps one then of the first tremendous creative thrust, I guess is a better word, of this whole concept is rooted in the necessity for having a sense of one's own persona, a sense of somebody. I don't think of his name, but he's a psychiatrist anyway in New York, and he teaches at Union Theological Seminary. That's as close as I can get to him. He wrote a book some years ago on, well, I don't remember the title of the book, but the story that he tells in there, I do remember. It is of a man, a mother and two children who went into a restaurant to get lunch. And the waitress came over to take the order, and the mother gave her order, and the daughter, who was older than the brother, gave her order, and then the waitress turned to the little boy and said, "What will you have?" And before he could make a sound, his mother said, "Oh, I will order for him. I know what he wants." But the waitress was very perceptive. She insisted, and she even called him young man. "Young man, what will you have?" And the daughter said, "I will order for him if Mother wants, because if Mother were not here and we were together in the restaurant, I would order for him." But the waitress insisted, "What will you have?" And with a kind of muted utterance, he said, "A hamburger." And she said, "With ketchup and mustard and relish and onions, the works." And then, like a soft echo, he said, "Ketchup and relish and onions and ketchup, etc., and the works." She went away. She gave the mother's order and the daughter's order, and then with full voice, so the boy could hear it, "One hamburger, the works." And the boy, in utter amazement, turned to his mother and said, "Mother, she thinks I'm real." She thinks I'm real. Now, this is what I'm talking about. Now, there can be no involvement in freedom if my own sense of reality is zero. I can have liberty, but no freedom. No freedom. Now, let's move to the next step. This sense of the definition, the working definition of freedom that I've been amplifying. This means that the individual then cannot escape the necessity for accepting responsibility for his own actions, private and public. And this is rough. The great insight that comes into American society from the George Washington myth of the cherry tree is relevant here. Who cut down the cherry tree? The myth has Father Washington asking his son George. And George said, "I did it with my little hatchet." I will let nobody take responsibility for my actions. I will undergird the integrity of my act with my own guts. My own guts. I will not let anyone rob me of the right to be me. Now, of course, this is not easy. This is not easy because there's something so wonderful about being able to make somebody else responsible. One of the great contributions that the science of psychiatry, clinical psychology, and all of these other very wonderful disciplines of healing for the human spirit. One of the interesting sidelights of that is that unless they're very sensitively dealt with, they somehow tend to paralyze the nerve center of the individual who and to keep him from taking responsibility for his own actions. I am as I am because my grandmother was prematurely gray, and I'm allergic to gray hair on young faces, and it made a cripple out of me. And therefore, I'm hostile, not because I am, but because of my grandmother. Now, this is wonderful and convenient, but one has to be very careful, it seems to me, because no one must usurp my right to say, I did it. I did it. I did it. Now, this is one of the first important and radical implications of human freedom. If I let anyone take responsibility for my own actions, then I give to them the power of veto and certification over my own life. And no man is worth that, however good or holy or ungood and unholy he may be. So that's the first. I must take responsibility for my own actions. This is the corollary that follows from this concept of freedom. Because in assuming responsibility for my own actions, I confirm the grounds of my own self. My own authenticity, my own, well, whatever it is, my own that. Now, the second kind of responsibility is a little more difficult. It is responsibility for my reactions. Now, this is rough. And this is what freedom means, I think. Responsibility for my reactions to the events of my life. As was suggested way back at the beginning when I took a little detour. We are back there now. We are surrounded by these things that make of us victims. And we've got to deal with them. Many years ago, when we lived in Oberlin, Ohio, Oberlin was a convenient stopping place between Chicago and New York for people who were driving. So we discovered that we had so many friends who suddenly discovered that they were our friends, and about 11 o'clock at night the phone would ring and said, you know, we were just passing through and we remembered that the Thurmans lived here, and so we just thought we'd give you a ring and see whether you were home, and then being a gentleman, you said, well, where are you? Oh, we are at a filling station 4 blocks away. And I said, well, what are your plans for the rest of the night? I mean, you know, and they just said, well, oh, we don't want to bother you, but they came, and so this particular night we had only eggs and bacon, which is, I mean, they're all right unless you're fighting cholesterol or something like that. But so I bought a dozen eggs that afternoon from Billy Wright's store. And all the eggs were eaten that night. And Mrs. Thurman had an idea about making an experimental cake that involved using about 9 eggs. So the next day, around 11 o'clock, I went over to Billy Wright's store to get a dozen eggs. And they cost me 4 cents more a dozen. Now, from yesterday afternoon until 11 o'clock the next day, I'd been as kind to my family as I knew how. I'd been as self-respecting, as decent as any other sort of somebody who was trying to make it. But that had nothing to do with it. I had to pay 4 cents more for a dozen eggs. This is the human predicament. Now, given this predicament, how does the free spirit work it over, knead it, and extract from it that which will nourish the integrity of his own sense of being and meaning and freedom? takes responsibility for his reaction to the events of his life. Now, it is true that we cannot control them. This is a part of the given. But because we are thus victimized, does it rob us of the sense of responsibility? You remember in Oedipus Rex, after he had done this, he'd been victimized by the fates, or however you say it, and he'd married his mother, and he had these children, and life was just going on, and then the oracle got to him, and he found what he had done, and the oracle said that he had to be banished and be a wanderer. What did he do with this? He had to go, but he had to retain some margin of his own clear sense of responsibility. So what did he do? With his own hands, he dug his eyes out. I will not let the events of my life take the initiative out of my hands. Even though I can't change them, I will hold the initiative and thus establish in my own spirit the beachhead of my own freedom. So, I'll stand quick. Just a little more, please. So that I must take responsibility for my reactions. Because this is an area in which I do not ever have to say yes. The vote, my vote, for the things for which I will stand with my life, and the things against which I will stand, is a vote that only I can make. And if I don't do it because of the external condition that has me gripped, then I give up my right to be a man, a free man. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a hell of heaven or a heaven of hell. He's not pipe dreaming. This is one of the elemental and basic facts that's a part of the ingredient in the human enterprise. I am responsible for my reactions to the events of my life, even though I did not create the events, even though I may not be able to control the events, even though I may not at any given moment in time be able to change the events. I hold the right to determine how I will deal with them. And I shall not become, therefore, the prisoner of the events of my life. I'm responsible for my actions. How many other people contribute to how I'm acting? Ultimately, the lazy Susan stops at my chair.